Welcome to technical session number 47, where we're going to be talking about securing a SOHO, or small office, home office, wireless and wired network. Some of the stuff is going to be reviewed from previous sessions that we talked about, but it's good to reiterate and maybe go into a little more detail. Our objectives for this particular session are going to be to explain the value of going the extra effort to protect the data on a SOHO network. We're going to be talking about describing the strategies for securing both wired and wireless networks, and describe the unique strategies for securing a wireless SOHO network itself. Behavior skills and mindsets we wish to keep in mind for this particular session are going to be adaptability. We are in an industry that is constantly in a state of flux. It's moving, it's changing. We have to be able to shift our perspective and change with it. We cannot change the winds, but we can adjust our sails, so to speak. And persistence. Probably one of the best traits for someone in IT. What do you do when you get knocked down? What do you do when you can't solve a problem? Do you take your ball and go home? Or do you pick it back up, dust yourself off, and get back in the game? All right, importance of protecting SOHO routers. So whether we're using wired or wireless, if we don't use the proper settings, configurations, we can create major security risks for both our personal data, our company, business, our accounts, everything. And some people just have that mindset like, well, I don't do anything crazy online. I don't need any security. It's not a big deal. Everything you do online, everything you look at, everything you search, all the information you put in helps develop profiles. Data mining. It allows them to better target you with adware. If it's a company, they can better spearfish your organization because they know what you value, what your interests are, what you're looking for. Try to gain greater access. If your wireless network is unsecure or open, then basically an intruder can easily gain access to your network resources through the internet. There's an old network attack called war driving. It's not readily used much nowadays, but it's basically people quite literally driving around looking for open networks. Or if they could bypass your network or crack your network, they would do what's called ward chalking, and then they would literally write down your SSID and password on the side of your building or on the sidewalk in front of your house. So other people who are driving by would be able to get it. Now, once the intruder has access, they can use a variety of attacks or operations, such as, at the very least, bare minimum, steal your internet bandwidth. That's the very least they can do. You know, and side note, I would like to thank my neighbor for providing me with internet for at least 5 years before I decided to get it myself. It could be perform disruptive illegal acts. Remember where we said if somebody's going to do something illegal, they're not necessarily going to use their name and phone number or sign in to do so. They want yours. So the finger points back at you rather than at them. Same thing with networks. If they're going to do something terrible, they're probably going to utilize somebody else's network. So it goes back to that host rather than to their own network. They could possibly steal sensitive information. They can utilize the hosts on your system as part of a denial of service on somebody else, or they can perform a denial of service on you. They could also infect the entire network with malicious threats, Trojans, worms, viruses, things of that nature. All right. SOHO networks and security overview. So there's a number of ways we can kind of work to secure our networks. Again, remember we keep talking about layers. There is no one surefire thing that's going to protect your network. You have to create a layered system, much like home security. Nobody can turn their house into Fort Knox. Most of us don't have the resources or time to be able to do so. But what we can do is make ourselves a less appealing target than our neighbors. And that is the general premise for security in networks and at home. You want to be a less appealing target. If it's going to take them a whole lot of time for a potentially low payoff to get past your network, it's not going to be worth it for them. They're just going to move on and go to somebody else. And that's generally what we want to create. So what are some things we can do? Changing our default usernames and passwords, MAC filtering, static IPs, so we can do IP filtering, setting up a DMZ, or what was it called? A screen subnet. Port forwarding and mapping, port triggering, firewall settings, all of these things, which we'll kind of go over here in the next few slides. So usernames and passwords. Typically when an ISP, your internet provider comes and installs the network or the router in your network, they're going to ask you to change it right then and there. But some people buy their own and bridge to it and then leave the old passwords on there. Or sometimes the installation professionals don't go through the full checklist and leave the defaults on there as well. And like with the routers, when I sent out passwords, when I sent out those links to you guys, it showed you all the default sign-ins and passwords for pretty much every router on the market. Same is true for their Wi-Fi. Old ones used to tell you exactly what type of router it was. Made it easy for you to figure out what the password was. Like the old Linksys Wi-Fi routers or wireless access points. They would say like Linksys, 527832 would be like their sign-in. And you're like, oh, okay, well then the sign-in is just password. All right. On all of our devices, not just on our networks, change default sign-ins and passwords. Anybody go in and do the router, change the sign-in and password for their router, not the SSID and password for your Wi-Fi, but your actual router password? Anybody do that? One of you? Two of you?
And then I had to do it twice because then I forgot the original password. So
That's fine. Three. Couldn't figure it out. Okay. At least you tried. But yeah, these are good things to do. Don't allow default username and passwords to stand, because if they do, it is super easy to bypass. Same thing on printers, same thing on computers. Disable guest accounts, all that kind of fun stuff. We don't want to leave easy access points for people to get in. MAC filtering, small businesses or homes, there's only a limited number of devices on it, so we can enable MAC filtering and put in the MAC addresses for all the devices that we have and set it up. Basically, if you are not among this club, if you are not on the list, so to speak, you do not get access to the network. We also know that it is easy to bypass through the use of virtual machines, but we also know locks keep honest people honest. And it's a layer. It's just one more step that we're putting in the way of somebody gaining full access to our networks. This works for small numbers of computers. When you start getting above like 15 devices, it starts to become unmanageable. Or if you have a lot of guests coming and going, it can cause problems. Static IPs, the network is small enough, you can assign specific IPs to every single device on the network, much like you did with your MAC addresses. And then you can make it so that only those IPs can have access to the network. Again, this is something that can be bypassed, but layers, creating layers. The DMZ or screen subnet. We talked about that. We have the two firewalls. We have the one firewall that splits off one segment of the network that would allow public access, but have much greater security for the interior. Understand if you do a DMZ on your home router, if you're not utilizing two, the DMZ for the home router quite literally just puts it where it's completely unprotected. So then there's quite literally no firewalls, no protection, nothing. It is just out there in the open. And if it is not heavily secured, it will basically be hacked to pieces as soon as somebody discovers it. All right. Port forwarding, also known as port mapping. We talked about this one the other day, where you could set up, if we had devices inside that we didn't necessarily want to be easily accessed from outside, we can assign it a random port on the switch or the router coming in. And then as it comes in and it hits the router will redirect it to that particular device. We talked about it in the sense of security cameras. They typically operate on port 80, or 443, but these are going to be ports that hackers are going to be looking for instantly. So we would set it to something like port number 35872. And then when it hits that, then we know it goes to the front porch security camera, port 80. So that would be our port forwarding or port mapping. Port triggering. We also discussed this. It's one of those things where you would have some form of instant happen where it would open the port for a particular amount of time and then close the port when you're done. So it allows for a dynamic port access so that the port is not open all the time, leaving you open or creating a larger attack surface. So the example we used on this was FTP, which is port what? What is port FTP? 2021. There we go. There we go. Just so you know, Justin, when you cover your face like that, it makes me want to call on you.
I'm trying to remember my ports.
So we'll get there. We'll get there. We'll get some practice today. All right, so that's port triggering. And why do they use the two? It's an older port. Typically one is for sending, one is receiving. So if I send a request out through port 20, the firewall would automatically open up port 21 because it knows communication is going to be coming that way next. It wouldn't be open all the time, only when there's that triggering event of me sending something out port 20. Firewall settings. So most hosts have built-in firewalls. We have the Windows Defender firewall on almost all systems. Most routers kind of have built-in ones that you can use for the entry point. We can use them in a stateful sense, where it's paying attention to the state of the conversation, or we can turn on packet filtering and utilize things called ACLs, or access control lists. And then we would utilize either a whitelist or allow list and say these are the only sites that are available. And then do a deny list or a blacklist, where we would say these sites are not allowed, everything else is allowed. So we can have that set on our firewalls, and we can adjust the intensity of the scrutiny for the stateful firewalls, because we've talked about this before. Usually what happens is if somebody goes in and they're like, oh man, firewalls are great. I want lots of security. I want maximum protection. And they'll go put it on max, and then all of a sudden it starts blocking every single thing that's trying to communicate with the internet and asking your authorization and request. And after about 30 or 40 of these over the next 5 minutes, the person goes back into the firewall and goes, this is crazy, and just turns it all the way off. When in reality, we probably should be somewhere in the middle. All right. Content filtering or parental controls. Good stuff. Works in both businesses and in the home. where you can, filter based on content type. So you can say like no gambling, no adult sites. For kids, you can say no material above a G rating or something like that. You can block individual sites. You can block keywords, but we have to be kind of specific or careful in the type of words that we use. A couple funny instances of that was one of the TAs I worked with was trying to set up a camera in a college classroom. And so they were trying to set up a camera, and every time they would try to search the company, it wouldn't allow it. Firewall would block it, wouldn't bring it up. And they needed to get to the company to be able to download the drivers for the camera in order for the camera to work. Well, the problem was they were using content filtering based off keywords, and the company they were trying to look up was Jabra. And it had bra in it. And then Google had a similar one when they were trying to, they didn't want people looking up firearms and all that stuff on their site. And, so they wanted to use keyword blocks, for people's general searches and all this stuff. And they were trying to be good citizens and all that kind of fun stuff. And then anime fans really struggled trying to look up their, favorite anime, especially if you were a Gundam Wing fan. Is that gun in it? So we have to be careful about the words we're using, keyword searches and stuff like that, and how we input them, because they can inadvertently affect other searches. So that's just two examples of keywords that were put in that they didn't want people searching, and it inadvertently affected other things people were doing. Questions on that? For anime? All right. There we go. So other security tips we can use. Disabling ports. If there are ports that we don't necessarily, there's functions or protocols that we are not going to be using, they need to be closed. We need to essentially shrink our attack surface as much as possible, because one of the first things an attacker is going to do when they come upon a network, typically, although it does send off alarm bells if they do it, too brashly, is do a port scan. And they're going to look for any openings in your network. So they're going to start scanning all of your ports. It usually raises alarm bells in security if somebody starts doing this. So they may ping one port at a time slowly and see if they can find an open one. So we want to mitigate that as much as possible and close off any unused ports or protocols. Update firmware, make sure everything's up to date, BIOS, all that kind of fun stuff, because vulnerabilities can be discovered. And if we are not updating our firmware, the hackers will basically know what attack vectors to use to bypass the vulnerabilities in our system. So we need to make sure things are up to date. If you haven't updated your firmware in a while, maybe do a search and see if there's a new version out for the BIOS you have or UEFI. And make sure if it's a different version, are there changes in the security protocols? Were there vulnerabilities that were discovered that were closed up? And if it makes sense, if there are those things, then go ahead and update your firmware sometime. And make sure you get everything secured or buttoned up. Same thing on all of our other devices with regards to like printers and network devices and all that stuff. We need to make sure all the firmware is kept up to date. Physical security, we talked about that yesterday. Perimeter fences, guard shacks, bollards, security cameras, locked doors, tokens, biometric scanners, All of these things creating layers to protect our systems, because if somebody has physical access, they own our systems. There was a security instructor who was talking about this, where he had a student who was particularly, for lack of a better term, arrogant about their skill in security, and they were working on systems and all that stuff. And they had a activity where they're supposed to harden their system as much as possible to see if it can be breached. This guy spent about 30 minutes on it. They had the whole morning, and then he was like, man, nobody's getting past my system. I'm all good. And da 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 da. And then he's like, I'm just gonna leave early and go to lunch. Leaves early. The professor goes over and starts ripping all the cables out of the system. The guy came back and he's like, what the heck? And he's like, you forgot about physical security. So physical security is a part of IT. We tend to be focused or concentrate more on the software and hardware side. And we tend to, have blinders on to the rest of the world around us. We can't operate that way. All right. Other settings with regards to our wireless security. We talk about our SOHO routers, or small office, home office routers. And we're going to talk about that default SSID, setting of encryption, disabling the broadcast, WPS, and antenna and access point placement. So first, default SSID. This needs to be changed, and the passwords need to be changed on a regular basis. If you've been still using the same SSID and password for more than a year or so, your network is, each day that passes, essentially your network becomes more and more vulnerable. All it takes is, time. And if they can figure it out and they can get past it, then they've gotten through your system, your first barrier. Next, our set of encryption. Currently using the WPA standards, WPA with TKIP, WPA2 with AES, and now we have WPA3. If we have an extremely old system or old hosts on that system, we may only be able to use WEP, even though that is a cracked protocol because it uses static keys. It's better than nothing. So it's at least some protection of your data. You're not just transmitting over open air. So use the strongest one you can use based upon the systems on your network. So whatever they can handle, use the strongest one. All right, so that is our encryption. All right, SSID broadcast. As we know, when we go in and we turn on our Wi-Fi setting on our phone, and we go and we look, and it gives us a list of networks that are available. These are networks that are broadcasted, meaning they're sending out pings regularly saying, this is my network name, this is my network name. Well, if you already have a sign-in and password embedded in your phone and it's remembered, the network's there, excuse me, then you don't necessarily need to broadcast it. So then the layman, when they're looking for Wi-Fi networks, won't see yours. It won't show up on that list. Now, a IT professional can use what's called a Wi-Fi analyzer and absolutely see your network and its name, even if you have the broadcast disabled. And you can download free software to turn your phone into a Wi-Fi analyzer, so you'll be able to see those networks. Again, technically considered a security method. In reality, not necessarily, but again, we're creating layers, right? I know I keep saying it, you're like, yes, you said it like 50 times. It's because it's important. Create layers to our security. Next, WPS. routers and printers and all that stuff have this particular technology. It usually creates a 8 to 10 digit pin that, you know, gets transmitted to your device and allows your device to hook up to the internet after you push a button on it. Problem being, this is a cracked protocol, and they don't even need physical access to your device to be able to trigger the WPS key. If this is on any of your devices, your router, your printers, or what have you, turn it off. Go into the settings, disable it. This is a super easy bypass for somebody who knows what they're doing. So while you're in there changing the sign in and username for your router, turn off the WPS. I know it's convenient and it's super awesome. You go up and you just press a button and you're hooked up. It's great, but it's also super convenient and easy for bad actors to bypass your security. So cracked protocol, do not use. Questions? All right. Antenna and access point placement. This is what we don't often think about much. Now, most routers and wireless access points, for the most part, are parabolic, or they send out, not parabolic, it's like omnidirectional antennas. So they send out signals in all directions. It's like a donut, pushes everything out horizontally. Which is why if you have one of those routers with the little antennas, you need to make sure the antennas are straight up and down, because then it sends the signals out horizontally. If you have them angled, it's going to push the signals up and down at angles. So if you have them, make sure they're vertical so they kick vertically out. So, and since it's omnidirectional, the signals can exceed our office, home, what have you. And though it may be cool to have Wi-Fi while you're sitting out in the yard and all that kind of fun stuff, it's also cool for the bad actors to basically sit on the curb in the drive, you know, in a car and be able to access your network. In an office setting, they can just be sitting in the parking lot and continually getting attempts to try to get past your network, bypass your security. So we need to make sure we were placing our antennas in a central location. And if we have a small office or we have to use multiple antennas, we actually might consider decreasing the power of our antennas, which will shrink the bubble of the transmission, because we want to try to minimize how much outside of our actual office or home or what have you, the Wi-Fi transmission goes out. So don't let that one slip by you. One security measure with regards to Wi-Fi is decreasing antenna power so that you're, you know, shrinking the available bubble for Wi-Fi usage. Some companies will go through extreme and they'll use what's called RF absorbent materials on exterior walls, which is radio frequency. And so they'll use special coatings on windows or certain types of insulation. Does not allow radio signals to transmit through it. But if you are not the one building the building and you're just renting a office from a landlord or something like that, then I would not bank on those materials being in place. So, questions on this? And we've come to the quiz.
Can you go back really fast, please?
What? Everybody started their quiz already. Right here?
Yes. Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, quiz. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, revelations. It's not even 10 o'clock and we're through our first T session. All right. Go ahead and stop.